Luocha is a 5-star imaginary character residing in the path of the abundance. Luocha, unlike the other limited abundance characters in the same path, had no exclusive qualities to his identity within the role. That is unless you count overhealing. However, unlike the other long-forgotten characters in Honkai Star Rail, Luocha has become one of the best characters in the current meta because of the sheer amount of heals he brings to the table. If you told me in 2023 that Luocha was going to be top tier with no real tweaks to his kit, I would claim you're bluffing. Here we are though, 2 years later, with the release of Castorice, where that same statement couldn't be more true. Honkai Star Rail 2 years ago was a completely different game. Truly, it's unimaginable how much the game has evolved or devolved since then, depending on your perspective, of course. 2 years prior, Luocha was to release in the second half of patch 1.1. Being a limited character, and the first abundance one at that, is bound to give undisputed value. Considering the only options we had in the form of abundance were 2 characters, one of which didn't have a cleanse and required another character to make up for said shortcoming, it wasn't a shocker how fast Luocha was to ride to the top. Given that Luocha had a ton of healing, gave a skill point every single turn, and will help allies in the form of an emergency heal that would make him the most comfortable character HSR would ever see. While his main selling points weren't too useful in the 1.1 meta, he at least gave well above what was needed for the average team, and that alone would contribute to his short-term success. As the later metas developed, discussions centered around the skill point economy would become more and more prominent. At the height of those discussions would be Luocha as the undisputed best in slot of every team composition, because for the most part, it can guarantee every single team comp a skill point every single turn. Considering how greedy the early damage dealers were in terms of skill point consumption, that alone would make Luocha all the more valued. That seemed to be his best quality by far at this point in Honkai Star Rail. It wouldn't be until the second half of 1.2 where Luocha would begin to find more value from the rest of his kit with the introduction of Blade. Before we do talk about Blade, there is one thing prior to Honkai Star Rail's release that is worth mentioning. Luocha and Blade were characters that previous beta testers had access to. The claimed synergy that these two had were announced to be game-changing. Luocha had a passive out-of-turn heal ability that instantly procced whenever an ally would fall below half health, regardless if they took some damage from an enemy. Considering Blade would drop himself below 50% HP at times, he could guarantee a safety net whenever things went south. This announced synergy was really hyped leading into the release of Blade. Looking back on this, it's kind of crazy how those two have no form of wombo combo aside from the passive heal provided by Luocha, but it's still funny that Blade doesn't even consume a skill point every single turn, so that being provided from Luocha wasn't even a game changer either. To be fair though, Bronya being best in slot with Blade gave the skill point generating aspect of Luocha a place in the team comp. So it felt as if Luocha being the only limited character of his class early on would be his biggest strength, but at times, it felt like his biggest weakness also. In hindsight, it really was his biggest weakness. But for the time being, he felt absolutely without a doubt the best in any team comp. He did it all, and that's all he needed to do, even if his best aspect wasn't even needed in the meta at the time. It wouldn't be until the first half of 1.3 where we were to finally get a grasp of just how important what he provided to the team was. Then we were to receive our first consistently greedy damage dealing character on the skill point economy with Denheng and Beaver Lune. Daniel felt like the first character that Luocha was absolutely necessary to have in the team composition regarding defensive options. Daniel consumed 3 skill points every single turn, unless he had his ultimate ready. This will mean in a team comp alongside this character, you would need to ensure that you could provide him those skill points every single time he was to take his turn. Considering Luocha gave a skill point every single turn, while still being able to effortlessly keep the team healthy, this is where he truly began to shine. Daniel was the best damage dealer at the time of his arrival, and that would easily allow Luocha to remain top tier for as long as this character is still relevant in terms of DPS output. Considering that was the only thing Daniel needed from Luocha, which was skill points, this team would continue to be meta indefinitely, until later abundance like Huo Huo released. Funnily enough, with the later release of 4-star Quantum Abundance Lynx, Blade was to have his best in slot sustainer. Lynx offered more to work with the strengths of Blade than Luocha did, and that alone was to give slight insight into what shortcomings Luocha had in this kit. He was a jack of every trade, master of only one, with that only one being overhealing. Hujuan was also to release as the first limited preservation. which also was to make the defensive option category a tad bit more competitive. It also didn't help, as her whole gimmick was damage mitigation and absorption, which, you guessed it, contributed to the short-term hard-hitting enemies meta. In some situations, depending on how squishy your characters were, they may even be one-shot with Luocha as your defensive option versus having Fujuan. This prompted players to build their harmony and debuff your characters more tanky, or playing the game manually to work around the one-shotting mechanics present. Fast forward to the later release of Huo in the first half of 1.5, and Honkai Star was to receive its second limited abundance character. Now around this point in time, Luocha was still top tier, as Daniel depended on him. Huo, however, would bring more to the table, and while not being as skill point positive, she at least gave more ultimates and raw attack stats to Daniel, which prompted a more so better hyper carry composition than that of one with Luocha present. She just had more utility. It also doesn't help, around this point in time, there was enemies that could crowd control your whole team or parts of your team, messing up the action forward in the process, which was known as reverberation. In my opinion, this mechanic was and still is the most BS mechanic the devs have ever added, with the only reason being trying to sell Huo as a character. They honestly need to go back to the drawing board with this one. Huo was to become an even better defensive option for Daniel and hypercarry future teams, and that alone was to quite literally push Luocha out of the meta. With each subsequent release of defensive options in the future patches, Luocha's value would become more and more diminished. His strengths were again his actual weaknesses, and this notion would continue on for almost 2 years, until the later edition of Castorice in 3.2. Much like the recent Bailu video, I've done yet again another long patch leap for the historical analysis. And the truth is that the early abundance, Luocha included, had no presence or relevance in the later Star Rail metas. You could use these characters, but there was always a better option. They were never best in slot. That was all the more true until Castorice was to release, because like Bailu, Luocha was to rise, and this time further than Bailu did, to the top of the meta. Castorice's release in 3.2 truly was the best thing to happen for Star Rail, and I know I've repeated this same sentiment, and it feels like every video at this point, but with every abundance character that felt unusable, finally finding a place in the meta is what made the game refreshing and a lot more interesting. Luocha now being the arguably best sustainer for Castorice at the time of recording would have surprised anyone that played in late 2023. And we'll discuss Hyacinth later. Luocha is perfect for Castorice and her team comp and all contents, all because of his overhealing, which is his main selling point. The sheer healing and uptime of his healing is unmatched for Castorice and her team, and that makes for a very cozy autoplay experience. Castorice teams really only want one thing, and that's healing, too, if I want to be less disingenuous. But at the very least, the most important thing is what Luocha is best at doing. So Luocha went from being top tier to a character people regretted using their Stellar Jades on to yet again becoming top tier in the Castorice teams for the current meta. It's also at a time in which he is now technically also given to the player for free, or rather the player has a choice. I don't know if we should be happy or disappointed that he's now being given away for free. I don't mean that in a gatekeeping way. It just means that, to me, Hoyoverse no longer values him as a character worth using a banner slot on, which does explain his worth outside of Castorice teams, but it is what it is. One last thing I wanted to mention was regarding Hyacinth's inevitable release in the first half of 3.3. I don't need to sugarcoat it. It's very obvious that Luocha won't be the best in slot after release of this character, as she quite literally gives a ton of healing to the team, which is a bare minimum for Castorice teams, but additionally gives a massive health boost to the whole team, which is massive utility for Castorice and her memory sprite. The fact that Luocha and the other abundance were to yet again be very valued in the meta is enough for the Traveler to finally retire. Until then, you have yourself the most comfortable meta, like the old days of late 2023, because that's exactly what Luocha did best. Let's also not forget that previously released limited characters are stated to potentially receive buffs in the future, which could totally bring back Luocha in a like 2027 meta or something. There was also one aspect of Luocha's kit that I didn't bring up, but maybe later down the line, his ultimate will prove to be useful for something. Thank you for watching, and have a cozy rest of your day.